All right.
And we log off our videos now, eh?
Yeah. Or Michelle, I don't know if Michelle wants to stay on with me. It's fine on the video.
Oh, now I can't see anybody's face. Oh, they've hidden them.
But you should be able to see the faces. I see Michelle and Anita right now.
I hit optimize for video sharing, so it got rid of my.
Oh, I see.
Is it important that you be able to see our face? That's probably not that important.
No.
Okay. All right. So I'm just checking in and seeing that we do have. I see some familiar names and any. Okay. All right. So welcome everyone to the webinar on a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. And so what I want to do before we get started is just to make sure that everybody can see and hear me. So can somebody go in the chat and just let me know if you can see the screen with the Fair Vote Canada logo and if you can hear me talking. Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, always good. One time I spent like a half hour talking to myself, so after that, now I check. So anyway, okay. So thanks again for joining us. My name is Anita Nickerson. I'm the Executive Director of Fair Vote Canada. I'm joined here by Michelle Clifford, who is on our board and one of the leaders of our Toronto team, and Réal Lavergne. Réal, can you mute yourself? Who is going to join us, who is our president, and is going to join us at the end for some questions. So if you have questions as I'm talking, if you could use the Q&A box for that, that would be great. And that way we're not having to check two places for people's questions. So feel free to chat with each other in the chat and post your questions for us for after the presentation in the Q&A. Okay, so I will get going now. So if you aren't aware of Fair Vote Canada is a national citizens campaign for proportional representation. We have chapters and volunteers across the country. We are 99% volunteer powered. Trying to think of if there's anything else you really need to know about Fair Vote. I think that would probably pretty much cover it. All right, Michelle, who is switching our slides for us. So the topic of today's presentation is going to be a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. And I've seen through the Democracy Exchange Festival and the summit that citizens assemblies have been talked about quite a bit already. There's been sessions focused on deliberative democracy, and that's fabulous. It's amazing to see the wave, if I could steal an expression, for this kind of participatory democracy. So some of this is going to be a review to many of you, as it's a basic introduction, and we're also going to talk about why this is such a good fit with our topic of electoral reform. Okay. Okay. So just on the basic issue, what is a citizens assembly? It's an assembly of citizens formed to deliberate on an important policy issue. And it's based on a belief that when you give citizens, ordinary citizens, not experts, knowledge, resources, and time, they can find solutions to complex and challenging issues. And sometimes it takes a little bit to get past the skepticism about that, but the evidence is really strong that it actually works. People do not need to start off as experts. And in fact, starting off with an open mind and a blank slate can lead to even better outcomes. Citizens assemblies also can produce recommendations which are likely to be seen as highly legitimate expressions of the popular will. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in coming slides about why that is. Okay. So one of the main things that makes a citizens assembly different than, say, just a town hall meeting or a committee of politicians or a committee of experts or a commission is that a citizens assembly is designed to be what we would call a mini public. So the citizens on the assembly should be demographically representative of Canadians as a whole, as possible, as close as reasonably possible. So obviously we can't go into the grocery store and just drag a bunch of random people out and say, okay, now you're in a citizens assembly. Any process that you have is going to have an element of self-selection to it. But the idea with a citizens assembly is to overcome that to the largest degree possible, to make sure that the people sitting in the room are representative of Canadian society. And so there's special ways that citizens assemblies are commissioned to make sure that that happens, to make sure that, you know, it's half men and half women, that there's the number of Aboriginal, Indigenous people that there are in the general population, that there's a variety of education levels, that there's, you can stratify it any way you want to produce a body that's like the general population. And the idea is that what these folks come up with will be what the population would have come up with if everybody had this opportunity to sit down and think about it and debate about it and become informed. So another little point there I've just added on, since participation is voluntary, there you get the self-selection that does come into everything. Members should have their expenses and their time compensated. And that way, you know, you're making it more possible for people who are low income and have other commitments to be able to participate, sort of a little bit like a jury. So a few other things that are really important when you think about a citizens assembly is that the participants should be given enough time and expert help to learn, deliberate, and come to a consensus. So in terms of how much time they would need, these processes can be scaled up or scaled down. So you can have a very small group, you know, that might be called a reference panel or a citizens jury that might sit together for 2 days and talk about whether a community should invest in a community center. I mean, maybe that takes 5 hours or 10 hours to figure that out. But when you're talking about something like the Canadian electoral system, past processes have taken up to a year in the various stages that they go through. So it's important that the Citizens Assembly has enough time, and that in part that's dictated by them. So it's not like they get to 8 months and then it's like, okay, the funding's done now, whatever you came up with. They have to be able to feel confident in their recommendations. The other thing that's really important is independence. And this is especially important on electoral reform, and I probably don't have to explain why, but it's key for our issue. To safeguard assemblies from being hijacked by a predetermined agenda or partisan interest, for example. You know, we're Fairville Canada, we're a lobby group for proportional representation. We would not be running the Citizens Assembly for obvious reasons, because we already have an idea of what we would like to see. And the same thing, we wouldn't want this to be an arm of the government, etc. So it's really important that it's run by an independent third party who's commissioned to do that work, who actually has no position and background on that issue. What their expertise is running deliberative processes. Okay. But the government does have an important role, because you can have a citizens assembly that's a high quality deliberative process. I mean, I've talked to people who watched the Ontario Citizens Assembly and Electoral Reform, which was now more than 14 years ago. And wow, you know, they're amazed by it. Who in Ontario knew it happened? Not many people. And that's because the government failed on their end to promote the work of the Assembly. But in terms of it being translated into public engagement, that's where the government needs to step in and make sure that everybody knows who these folks are, what they're working on, why a citizens assembly process, and that's going to add to the engagement and legitimacy that they get. Okay. So just this summer, the OECD put out a report, which was really neat. It's called Catching the Deliberative Wave, and I've just put the cover of the highlights of it. The highlights alone were 48 pages, so if you're interested in it, I'd suggest you start with the highlights. The whole report is several hundred pages, but they looked at, I think it was 279 deliberative processes around the world. So processes that all followed the same sort of model, and they could be something, you know, very small or all the way up to the scale of a citizens assembly. And they looked at how they work, why they work, and why this is really a great tool to engage people and help our politicians with decision making. Okay. So I just picked out 6 things from their report that seem to sort of sum up why a citizens assembly in general. So the first one was you get better policy outcomes. And isn't that what we all want in the end? Is better. That's why people get into electoral reform or democracy in general. They want better policy outcomes from considered public judgment rather than public opinion. And I found that a really interesting choice of words, because public judgment is saying, an informed decision, a deliberative decision based on having all the information and having heard all the different points of view, rather than public opinion, which is useful at a point in time to get public opinion, but it's not quite the same as public judgment. Greater legitimacy to make hard choices. So as you've probably heard, if you've listened to other things about citizens' assemblies, one of the main things they're used for is to help give politicians a nudge on something where they want to act, but they can't quite do it. So that's why we're seeing citizens' assemblies around the world right now on climate change, right? Because what the science is telling us needs to be done is a little bit different than what the politicians are willing to do. So by putting ordinary citizens with no preconceived notions together in a room to study this and make recommendations, it gives the politicians sometimes the backing that they need to act on some of those things. And it enhances public trust by giving citizens an effective role in decision making. So one of the complaints we obviously hear a lot is first the government makes up their mind and then they put forward some kind of sham consultation, which is basically either they're going to ignore it or it's just a rubber stamp on what they already decided to do anyway. So citizens' assemblies are sort of designed to counteract that and do the opposite and actually give citizens a meaningful say in advising the government on their policy choices. Okay. Making the government more inclusive to a diverse group of people. So obviously, if we look at our parliament, while it's getting more diverse over the years, it's, if you look on the street or on the subway or whatever, you're seeing a different group of people in our parliament that are making the decisions than the general population. So citizens' assemblies, like I said, are going to represent the full diversity of Canada. And so they'll let people who currently don't have a voice in decisions. Ensuring those with money and power can't have undue influence on a public decision. So there's going to be no meetings with well-financed lobbyists and the Citizens Assembly, unlike some government decisions. And number 6, help counteract polarization and misinformation. And this is really, really key, because a lot of times we've seen this in the electoral reform referendums now, quite a few of them, that political polarization and misinformation that's widely accepted by people plays a huge role in public decision making. But citizens' assemblies basically go right around that and put people in a position where they're not going to be influenced by those considerations. Okay. So just to kind of make this a little bit more real, a couple of years ago, we had Shoni Field come and talk at our Fairville Canada AGM, and Shoni was on the BC Citizens Assembly. And she did a few comments just to start off in the first 2 minutes that I thought would really help you hear what I'm talking about from a first-hand point of view. All right, Michelle.
Everybody. This is a little weird not being there in person, so I'll trust the two of you at the front have to make faces if I'm totally missing the mark because I can't see the audience. So I was a member of the Citizens Assembly in BC, and when Anita was reading out that passage about the selection meetings, I got goosebumps because it truly was a magical experience. It was a life-changing experience. I'm still at this 15 years later. And it really was, there was that magic in the room. And the most common thing we heard over the next 18 months as we went around the province is people saying, I wish I'd got that letter. I heard those letters were going out and I checked my mail every single day. I wish I'd got a selection letter. And so there was a genuine desire among citizens to be involved in something really important that they felt could really sort of change how they experienced politics in the province. So the magic of the selection meeting sort of came crashing into reality in our first meeting of the Citizens Assembly, and we were bagpiped into the WASC Center, and it's this beautiful circular room, and we're sitting there, and Jack Blaney, our chair, gets up and says, I don't believe in Robert's Rule of Order. We're going to do this as much as possible by consensus, and you're going to learn to trust your fellow citizens. And I'm thinking, this man is crazy. Like, I'm not even sure we can agree on what's wrong. How on earth are we going to be able to agree on what's right and have something that's going to meet the needs of the many million British Columbians? So I don't think we got a lot of criticism that way we went into it all predisposed to change, that we were already made up our minds. And in fact, most of us, I remember, were thinking, well, this is a sort of fun exercise, but there's no way this is going to lead to any recommendation for change. Like, that just requires it just seemed impossible to us that we could do that. So I guess what really surprised me is, like, we're constantly told BC is the wackiest of the provinces, the most polarized of the politics. And so even agreeing on what was bad was going to be almost impossible for us. And so I guess what was most surprising for me, once we started listening to each other and listening to British Columbians at hearings across the province, reading 1,600 submissions, I guess the biggest surprise was that BC wasn't actually that polarized. We were united both.
Thanks, Michelle. So I just wanted to play Shoni because in 2 minutes, she sort of summed up everything I've been saying with PowerPoint slides from her real life experience. And there was a really good book written called When Citizens Decide, looking at the Ontario, BC, and citizens' assemblies in the Netherlands. And they found exactly what we're talking about, that people didn't have preconceived notions coming in. They didn't have a common idea that there was something wrong and it had to be fixed. They were actually fairly representative of the population, and yet they were able to make a recommendation for change that got the highest support for PR in Canada ever, 58% in 2005. So just to go reiterate the power of citizens' assemblies, when the one on climate change started in France, President Macron went to the Citizens' Assembly that he commissioned, and people were tweeting his comments to them. And this really just struck out at me when he said that a Citizens' Assembly would have saved me the yellow vest. And if anybody's been following the yellow vest movement in France and how much polarization and chaos that caused, to say that a Citizens' Assembly process could have prevented that if people had been properly engaged and trusting their fellow citizens is really powerful. Okay. So I'm not an expert in Citizens' Assemblies. There are many academic groups that are quite busy on this file. I just wanted to point out a few that have happened either in past years or now or recently. So for example, France's Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change is just finished. The UK Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change is just finished. Many people have heard about the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland that really started this latest wave of deliberative democracy on abortion. But what most people don't realize is that the Irish Citizens' Assembly has tackled a lot of other issues, many of them that didn't need to go to a referendum. They went to policy advice to the government, including gender equality, aging, climate. They're going to be having one on biodiversity. And they're having one right now in Scotland. So you can actually follow along online as they have a Citizens' Assembly on the future of Scotland. And they're doing it during a pandemic. Okay. So in the OECD report, they recommended when to hold a Citizens' Assembly or a deliberative process. What's a good situation for that? And they talked about three things: value-driven dilemmas, complex problems that require trade-offs, and long-term issues that go beyond short-term incentives of electoral cycles. And I just don't know how you could get a better billboard for a Citizens' Assembly on electoral reform. And all three of those just define our issue. It's driven by values. There are trade-offs with every system. And the main problem we have is that the short-term incentives of electoral cycles, partisan gain, partisan loss. They interfere with progress on our issue every single time. Okay. And so the sort of ordinary person way of looking at this is a little joke in the electoral reform community. You know, why would we have a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform to design a voting system? Why wouldn't we just have another committee of politicians? I mean, we've already had, what, 17 of those or something. Should the turkeys plan Thanksgiving? I mean, it's really as simple as that. Should the turkeys plan Thanksgiving? What's going to happen, do you think, if you leave it to the turkeys to plan Thanksgiving? So this is one of the reasons why Fair Vote advocates to get this out of the design of the system, at least, out of the hands of incumbent politicians whose own self-interest, they can't help it, it just is, whose own career self-interest is at stake, and into the hands of a group that represents the best interests of voters. Okay. So in September 2020, a few weeks ago, seems like a long time, Fair Vote Canada commissioned a national poll. We commissioned Ask Leger, Canada's largest marketing company, to ask Canadians what they thought about a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. Okay. And here's what we found in terms of support for the idea by province. Now, overall, it was 74%. Okay. So what we actually did was we asked two questions. One, we described what a citizens assembly and electoral reform would be and said, do you support this idea? And for that, we got 80% support. And then what we asked is, do you want it commissioned right now? It doesn't mean it has to start right now, but do you want the government to commission this as part of their fall plan? And we expect to see how much of a decline there was, because you know it's never the right time, right? So what we got there was 74%. So 80% for the idea in general, 74%, even during a pandemic, said, yeah, let's get a commitment to this right now. Okay. We also wanted to see if Canadians were able to connect the dots, because one of the things we spent a fair bit of time talking about in Fair Vote Canada, it was not counting methods and quotas and all kinds of stuff that really not many people care about. We talked about how electoral reform relates to issues that are in the top 10 at the door. So issues like environment, health, jobs, economy, engagement, all kinds of things that people actually name and care about, social safety net. And we asked people, how important do you think it is that we improve our democracy so that we can get lasting changes for the better, changes that are going to last beyond the next 39% majority government? And we found, I was actually really surprised to see this number. I wasn't sure what we would get, and we got 93% of people recognizing that democracy is really linked to long-term progress on other issues. Okay. And so the voting system really does matter. When people's votes actually count, then it has a huge ripple effect. It's a game changer. Okay. So we have research showing that electoral reform affects democracy. It affects voter turnout. It affects how knowledgeable people are about political issues and parties. It affects health, including how well countries manage infectious diseases and pandemics, how long people live. It affects economy in terms of the stability of the economy and economic growth. It affects the environment. It affects the strength of environmental policy and outcomes on environmental measures over decades. Okay. So one of the things that we hear fairly frequently is that it's just not the right time. So yes, electoral reform is important, but it's not the right time for it, because right now we have really more pressing issues that we have to deal with, and people will name some of those top 10 that I just talked about. And the irony of this is I've been doing this for over 10 years now, and I can tell you it's not about COVID. It's never the right time. So I picked this out from it was a proportional representation newsletter from 1919, where the PR Society then, which is the precursor of Fair Vote Canada, was celebrating that Mackenzie King was a PR supporter and the Liberals had passed a resolution that they were going to bring in proportional representation, which led to the first all-party committee in 1921. So when we say it's never the right time, while I have some sympathy for that, it's never going to be the right time unless we have political leadership and the ability to connect the dots. Okay? And more recently, here we have the leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, and the NDP ran on a platform, a lot of people don't know this, of a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform, and promised that this would be a top negotiating item in a minority government. And, this was a high priority issue. It was in the top 3. And then directly after the election, he said it's essential, but it's not urgent. And then last month, he said, a few weeks ago, we have to find the right moment. So the message from Fair Vote Canada is the right moment is now. Not now as in now today, now as in during the life of this parliament. Because if we wait until we get another 39% majority, it will be too late. A minority parliament is the time to commission the next step on electoral reform. Okay? And so just to finish off, I wanted to play a little video from the UK Citizens Assembly on Climate Change that just finished up. And yes, this is on climate, but if you can sort of imagine in your mind, what if this was in Canada? What if they were talking about electoral reform? And then you can kind of see how this will work, okay?
Dear resident.
Dear resident.
Dear resident.
You could be one of over 100
people selected to take part in the UK-wide Citizens Assembly
on how should
the UK tackle climate change. It's an interesting proposition.
I'm Amanda from Kent and I'm 27.
So this weekend is going to be about introducing you to climate change in a thorough way.
It was really exciting. To be told I was selected just seemed like a very rare opportunity.
Initially, I wasn't sure what it would be like, because I hadn't done anything like that before.
Perfectly honest with you, I didn't have a clue what zero carbon was.
I didn't know enough about climate change. I was open to information.
There were so many different perspectives and opinions. So many people of different ethnicity, different ages.
It was so nice to see, the representation of the UK.
The fact that you've given up time to come here and take this seriously is of the greatest importance.
It felt like the community kind of working together towards a problem that the whole world needs to face, to be fair.
Obviously, at the moment, we're all on lockdown.
Moving on to 3 internet weekends was quite good. We were still investigating things on our own. I'm not saying we're experts now, but we all have opinions.
Everybody's had the taste of this cleaner air. Surely most people would want that for their children and their grandchildren.
Well, if we treat climate change the same way as we're treating coronavirus, then we can do it.
We all want the government to take heed of our recommendations.
They need to act on it, but also to act on it fast. So it's not about saying, okay, we just keep deliberating over it over the next 1 year, 2 years.
They are by law bound to try to get to this target.
It's got to be done in a fair and positive way.
So if we don't act now, we're just going to run out of time and there won't be a future for any of us.
And if we can show that we can do it, then perhaps others will follow. I think somebody has to be a leader.
Okay. All right, so what I'd like to do now is bring on our president, Réal Lavergne, to help me answer questions. And I've just kind of put a little bit of Réal's bio up here. He's been with us, at least 6 or 7 years now. Since we started to endorse, well long before we started pushing for a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. So Réal and I are happy to answer any questions. So maybe, Michelle, do you want to close off the screen share? There we go. Okay. Let me just see what we have.
So we have 3 questions up there, Anita, and I could take the first 2. The third one I can't take at all. And I've had a chance to read them before you. So if you want me to take those, I'll bet you by the time I address those that you'll have more questions coming in, and there should be plenty.
Sure. This is everyone. This is your chance to ask anything you're curious about. There's no stupid questions. It's a small, friendly group of us.
So the first question is from Bryce Wilson, and he asks, are you still endorsing the use of first past the post with proportional representation? I interpret that to mean, are we still endorsing mixed member proportional, which elects some people using first past the post and then has top-up seats to ensure compensation? You know, I think that's actually a very good question in this context, because if we're talking about organizing a citizens' assembly, we're actually saying, well, it's up to the citizens to design the system that they want. And the interesting thing about the way you've posed the question, Bryce, is you have to ask yourself, why would Fair Vote Canada have ever taken a position in favor of mixed member? Why do so many commissions take a position in favor of mixed member? And I think the main argument is, well, that's what we're used to, and we assume that's what citizens want. So if we don't want to assume what citizens want, then we shouldn't go forward with any specific system. I mean, it could be regional list PR, it could be STV with ranked ballots, it could be mixed member, but it depends what it is that citizens are looking for. And usually in a citizens' assembly, the very first act will be to establish the principles against which you want to assess different systems, including first past the post, including probably ranked ballots, the way the Liberals interpret it as a single member ridings. I think the assembly would be asked to look at all of those things and apply those principles to them, and then come to their recommendations on that basis. Does that answer your question, Bryce?
Put in the chat, maybe.
He wouldn't have access on the mic.
Right, exactly. So we'll go to the next one, Réal.
Okay, the second question talked about arm's length from Fair Vote Canada. That was the question. Anita already explained that the Citizens Assembly has to be independent. Now, it's not absolutely independent, because for one thing, the terms of reference have to be set by somebody. And what we'd be advocating for is that the terms of reference be drafted by an all-party parliamentary committee. So it's very important that there be a consensus across all parties. And the idea is to try to get terms of reference that are at the very least non-partisan, in the sense of being manipulated to satisfy the partisan interests of one party. If you had a majority government, that'd be a little tricky. I would suggest that you have to try to find a formula that doesn't give absolute power to any one party, because that would defeat the purpose. But then organizing it itself, you can't have a party that has a particular point of view, as we are, be the one that is facilitating the process. So it has to be a professional company whose role it is to take an independent role, while of course accompanying the progress and helping it along to help to achieve consensus, which is what we're after here. And that does take some expertise when you have people with many different points of view.
I'm just going to jump in on that one too, as well, as about it being independent. Yes, the role for Fair Vote Canada, when a citizens' assembly gets started, part of their job will be to do public consultation. And that's where people for, against, and everything in the middle can show up at meetings, can submit recommendations, and it's up to the citizens' assembly to read through that and make of it what they will in the context of their expert learnings and stuff like this. So I remember, you know, an example from the BC Citizens Assembly, I heard, okay, so there was one particular party that was wanting one particular system, and they sort of inundated the Citizens Assembly with form letters saying, I like this, you know, with like pretty much no rationale to it. And it made it sort of so obvious that it's not like the Citizens Assembly discounted that, but they're looking at the input in the context of everything else. And in terms of the values, it can be set up different ways. Both of the Citizens Assemblies in BC and Ontario had fairly open-ended questions. It was basically, should the province change their system, and if so, to what, basically. It wasn't, they weren't narrowed down. BC was a lot freer in terms of their values. The government did not say you have to look at these values. They said you decide what values are important to you. Ontario came from an all-party committee and said, these are important values we want you to consider, but you can also consider additional values. So either way, it comes back to the citizens to decide what's important. So I'm having another couple of questions. What is the source or citation for that excerpt of Mackenzie King and PR? I can email it to you if I have your email. Just send it to me as a private message. Yeah, so it was PRSTV, and you have to realize that back in 1919, when the Liberals passed a resolution endorsing proportional representation by the single transferable vote, and again they revisited that with Mackenzie King at the second all-party committee in 1936. It was before MMP had been invented. So take that into context. That was PR back then. If you wanted local representation and proportional representation, that was the option at that time that was on the table. I'm just reading this next question from Simon, or if you seen this.
There's one just before that, Anita, that I have no idea what it's about. Someone's asking
I have
about.
no idea, Lorna. Citizens Assembly looking into democratic expression, the Canadian Commission on
Yeah,
we have no idea.
Can I just jump? Can I just jump in to say that other people cannot see those questions? So if you're answering one, could you read the question first?
Yes, so the question is anyone following the Citizens Assembly presently looking into democratic expression, the Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression? Again, the government is not doing a good job of publicizing the work of the Assembly. I have no idea what that is. Mind you, I said, I'm in my own electoral reform bubble, and while I follow the work of deliberative democracy experts, it's not an all day, every day sort of thing. So I could have missed it, but I would think I would have heard about it by now if the government was actually making an effort to promote it. The next question is.
I can take the next one if you like, Anita, because I've had a chance to read it. So this is from Simon Threckeld. It's a long question. I won't read the whole question, but getting down to his question, it's why not transfer the power to decide election laws from politicians and parties to citizens' assemblies? I don't know if that would require a constitutional amendment or a ruling by a Supreme Court or what. Probably it would require a constitutional amendment. That's probably a little tricky. But what we're trying to do, Simon, in this regard is to change the ethical perspective of this thing. Make politicians, make the public very, very aware. That turkey analogy that Anita gave us, why would you have turkeys plan the Thanksgiving dinner? Why would you have politicians plan the electoral dinner is really the question. And we have to get everybody to accept that politicians are in a conflict of interest, and that therefore the right thing to do is to hand the power of making recommendations over to a citizens' assembly. Whether the law changes or not, you can have that and still have legislators passing the laws. It's second best in a way, if you like, but I think it can work, but it does require a very significant shift in our way of thinking about these things.
Somebody else is asking about, well, there's a few questions, so I'm just sort of skipping around here a little bit. Have politicians in Canada been polled on the use of ICA? I don't know a company I could hire that would get 338 of them to answer the question or answer it honestly, setting aside their partisan affiliation. The way we are engaging politicians, well, obviously we commissioned that poll from Leger. We spread it out as widely as we could. We do visits with MPs as often as we possibly can, usually when there's something specific that we can ask them for. So we're thinking about gearing up for another one of those visit your MP about a citizens' assembly. We did that a year ago. It's one of those things where the head office really has to decide that they want to push this, or you're going to get a more informed politician, but you're also going to get tea and cookies and thanks for coming sort of thing. So we need the bottom up and the top down. So right now, as an activist campaign, Fair Vote Canada has a letter writing thing going on to Jagmeet Singh in the NDP that also copies Democratic Reform critic Daniel Blakey and National Director Anne McGrath, calling on Jagmeet Singh to call for a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform in this Parliament during the recovery phase, see if they can't exert some of their leverage to get something happening in this Parliament. So if you want to join that, I'm happy. Go on Fair Vote Canada's website. I'm sure that I have that on there. Go on our Facebook page. And the more people that they hear from, the more important they will know this is. That's the main thing, is they have to hear from enough people, because the most common thing we hear from all politicians, and I've heard it from NDP too, is not enough people care about this. They don't hear it when they knock on the door. So we need to be more vocal, and we also need to educate those politicians about how electoral reform impacts the long-term prospects of the things that Canadians actually care about, like strengthening our social safety net, just for example, like the environment. Réal, do you have an addition to that?
I wanted to add something on that, and if you like, you could read the next question, because I don't have the answer to the next question, so I'll let you digest that one while I add a comment on this one. I've actually met with quite a few politicians myself from all stripes, from the Conservatives, the Bloc Québécois, the Liberals, NDP, and the Greens. I've talked to all of them, and it's really, really interesting to see how they respond to the notion of citizens' assemblies. The first response is always quite guarded. It requires such a cultural shift for them to think that they were elected in order to fulfill their promises. Of course, they often don't, but this shift from shifting responsibility back to the citizens just strikes them as very strange, and it takes a long time. But if you think back to how you reacted the very first time that somebody talked to you about citizens' assemblies, weren't you suspicious? When you listened to Shawnee Fields talk about it a short while ago, her first thought was, what, consensus? Give us a break. This is BC. You're not going to get a consensus from us guys. And my own reaction when I was first faced with this issue was also very guarded, because, well, I have a university degree, and I'm kind of, I think in terms of experts ruling on these kinds of things. Ordinary citizens, what do they know? That kind of thing. So all of us have a big shift to make, but I think the shift is biggest for politicians, and it's going to take time. We have to be patient. We have to keep drumming this through and eventually get this idea accepted as the new conventional wisdom. That's where we need to go with this thing.
Somebody asked if the participants in the UK Citizens Assembly in particular are being compensated. I have no idea, but I could look on their website and find out. All I can really say from our point of view and from the point of view of experts on these processes is that you need to compensate people. Otherwise, you won't get the mother with 2 kids that can't afford to take time off her job. You will still get a fairly demographically representative group, but you risk having people get the letter and think, oh, I'd really like to participate in something like that, but I just can't afford it. So, and it's important to look at that as fully as possible, in terms of social justice, in terms of a just recovery. A just recovery means a recovery that includes everyone. So a citizens' assembly means that, the whole premise is that everybody in Canadian society has an equal opportunity to be selected for this. So if we want to make that as true to the ideal as possible, we have to make it as easy as possible for people to participate in. That means decent compensation. That means, means childcare. Whatever it is they need, we have to make sure that they have it so that it's not more privileged people. But we know when we look at who was on, for example, the BC Citizens Assembly, there wasn't that much of a difference between the people on the Assembly and the general population. I mean, they looked at this and a whole bunch of measures just to make sure these people weren't an elite unrepresentative group. And on almost every measure, they matched the people of British Columbia. I mean, they found a slight difference on level of education, slightly higher average level of education, and slightly higher average level of civic interest, but not to the point where it was discrediting the process by any means. Also, will the Citizens Assembly take power away from the MPs? No, this is a flip thing, right? Somebody's saying, well, won't it take power away from the MPs to make decisions? And then somebody else will say, how can we take power away from the MPs? Can't you make it binding? So it's sort of a balance. It's a balancing act. It's not going to take power away from the MPs. If we want electoral reform in Canada, they are going to have to pass it. It doesn't matter what kind of process we have, they are going to have to pass it. But what it does help us do is build the credibility of our case, the legitimacy of our case. If you looked at what happened in 2005 in BC, do you think that when 58% of people voted for single transferable vote, most of them could understand that system? I mean, and I love SCV. Don't get me wrong, okay? But if I asked the average person in Sobeys or whatever in 2005, can you explain to me how the quotas are transferred? There weren't a lot of people that could probably explain that, or an MMP system, or any electoral system. What they saw was that my fellow citizens sat down and looked at this for 11 months, and they're just like me, and they want to make democracy work better, and this is what they're recommending. And so that trust issue is really important. So it would strengthen the movement for electoral reform. It would build credibility across all parties. It would help push the MPs to do the right thing. It wouldn't take the leadership away from them. If they fear that people are going to see, oh, it looks like we can't do our jobs, the Citizens Assembly has to do it for us. That's not how people see it. People see it the opposite. They see it, wow, isn't that great that those politicians were actually willing to engage people in democracy in a meaningful way? That politicians get credit for that. They don't get the merit points for it. They actually get credit, and it builds trust in their government. You see another one, Réal?
Well, there are a couple more there. I don't have a problem with them, but I'm wondering if we're not out of time. I understood we were supposed to
maybe
go
like
only
3 more minutes, guys.
3 more minutes?
I think we get about 50 minutes for this according to.
Well, there's a question about who trains citizens and why a Citizens Assembly recommendation would have any more legitimacy. On the training side, what you are ensured of here, I think the main people training the citizens are citizens themselves. They get lots of study time, and they have the opportunity to call on any experts that they'd like to hear from. There would be some experts who are identified ahead of time, obviously to kick things off, but after that, if the Citizens Assembly wants to hear from some of them again, they can. If they want to hear from some other people, they can call on it. They get all the material that they need, and basically the key is time. They're given the time to study the issue to their satisfaction in order to be able to make recommendations.
In a way, the citizens do become experts. By the end of it, you've got somebody who's quite an expert in that one topic. Is there any other ones, Réal?
Well, there was a question here. There was a question about why a Citizens Assembly would have more legitimacy, and I think we've answered that question. When you have a parliamentary committee that's dealing with this issue, it is composed of politicians, and there'll be a majority on that committee that is composed of politicians that have a particular interest in one result or another. One of the things about a Citizens Assembly is all of those citizens, once they're done, they go home and they're done. And so they have no particular reason to want to advocate for one electoral system over another, other than looking for the electoral system that citizens themselves want in order to have a good democracy. And that ultimately is what makes their recommendations more legitimate than under any other format. Plus, they've had a chance to actually study the issue and consult with other Canadians before coming to their recommendations, which is not what you get with a referendum. People making a decision in a referendum, most of them, 80% of them have very little idea what they're voting.
To boil it down, it's a matter of trust. So one of the things that is used against electoral reform in many referendums, is when it's seen as cooked up in the back room by party X for their partisan benefit. So people do not trust politicians. I'm sure you've all seen, the statistics and the jokes about how the used car salesman is more trustworthy than the politician. And when you get into the issue of the politicians designing their own electoral system, that problem gets compounded. Where if, say, an NDP government decides, okay, this is the system, we've decided it's the best one, just trust us, or a Liberal government, or a conservative government, instantly you get a huge swath of the population that either distrust that recommendation because it came from that party, or just distrust the politicians in general on this, and is extremely susceptible to misinformation and messages being fed to them every day that you can't trust this, you can't trust this system, you can't trust it. And it wouldn't even matter if it's a great system. If the Citizens Assembly came up with the same system, people would look at that with more trust than if the politicians came up with it. And I mean, if the politicians of all the parties could get together and agree on something, then we might be able to overcome that. But we've been at this now, not we obviously personally, but we in Canada who've wanted electoral reform have been at this since 1921. And when you put them in a room together, unfortunately, it doesn't end well. So we need the help of our fellow citizens to get this issue to the next stage. So I want to take go ahead.
Well, I was going to just mention something by Tom Cullen here, who raises an interesting point about PR, asking about whether we've done any estimates of the cost of policy lurch. We haven't actually, but Tom, you give us an interesting number here. Just the example of having to cancel contracts under Doug Ford regarding only climate change, 231 million. If you have a reference for us on that, I'll bet you Anita would love to make a poster out of that for Facebook or something. So please be in touch with us and share that with us.
I remember there being, 758 renewable energy contracts that were canceled. And whether you agree with that or you don't agree with that, I think most people can agree that that whole policy lurch thing was a colossal waste of money. So just to put that into the perspective of a citizens assembly, I mean, if we did a citizens assembly properly and you got somebody, probably somebody from every riding in Canada, and you brought them together and you made sure the public was aware of it and could engage with it, we are talking about such an infinitesimally small percentage of the federal budget. It's like, it's like a fly on a starry night. You wouldn't, that's how small it is. It's the cost of a cup of coffee for every Canadian. So it's actually a really small investment, even compared to the cost of one example of policy lurch that Réal just mentioned, and Tom.
We were talking about 25 million, I think, at one point.
Yeah, 25, 50, whatever. I mean, I don't think you can cheap out on this.
Somewhere in there, yeah.
I mean, if you look at how much, if you look at how much it costs to run an MP's office for 4 or 8 years, one MP, we're talking about a very small amount of money to make sure that citizens are engaged, and it would pay dividends probably for generations. So anyway, okay. All right, so I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and I think 26 out of 28 people stayed with us for this whole thing, which I'm actually shocked. So thank you very much for spending an hour of your time to listen to Réal and I on a topic we're quite passionate about. I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, to check out Fair Vote Canada's Facebook page, facebook.com/Fair Vote Canada, and our Twitter account, and find the letter that you can send and edit it yourself to Jagmeet Singh, asking him to advocate for this. You can check out the website that Michelle has plunked in the chat, which is a separate independent website from Fair Vote Canada, just talking about the basics of a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. And if you want to get on our mailing list and follow our campaign, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to add you. Does that sound good? Anything else, Réal?
That's good with me, thanks.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a good night.